Hello everyone, I'm back with the next lesson. This is on chapter 10, the East Asian realm. And, excuse me, I didn't mean to do that. So, again, I always say this, I'm going to try to breeze through this really quickly and just kind of hit on the high points. Probably what I'll do is I'll cut out a lot of the stuff toward the end, which when it gets down to describing the individual regions, which is basically countries in this realm, and let you read a lot of that in your textbook. As always, I'm just going to kind of highlight things that aren't specifically mentioned in your textbook, or more, I guess, current events, more as the world is today than anything else as we go through this. So some slides I'll kind of breeze through, and some slides I'll go over in more detail. So we're talking about East Asia, and I want you to pay attention to what we're looking at on the map here. We just did South Asia, which this is India right here in our last lesson. You've got Nepal here, Bhutan here, Bangladesh here, so those are all in South Asia, if you remember from our last lesson. And now we're going to jump over to East Asia. Now you might be wondering about these countries down here: Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam. Those are all in our last lesson that's coming up after this one, Southeast Asia. So we've got three realms right here pretty close to one another in this corner especially. So when we talk about East Asia, the big player there is China, which is also the largest country by land area in the realm. But we have several other countries as well. We have Mongolia up here in the northern part of what we consider the China area. It's between Russia. You see, this is Russia up here, and this is China. And China actually does border Russia over here. So we got Mongolia sort of in between these two. And then we've got the two Koreas, North and South Korea. We've got Japan out here. And then we've got Taiwan down here. And that's kind of an interesting topic that we're going to get more into in just a few minutes. But basically, China claims Taiwan as their territory. And there are high tensions in the world right now because Taiwan is closely allied with the United States, and of course China is not. So this is kind of one of those countries or parts of the world that's kind of a flashpoint right now. Something that goes south really quickly right here if somebody makes a mistake or does something stupid. So one thing I want to point out to all of y'all is I'm quite a bit older than probably most of you taking this course, obviously. So back when I was young and in school, in my elementary and high school years, even into college, when we talked about East Asia, Japan was the giant in the room. Now, if we go back to the map, geographically, Japan is a lot smaller than China. But when I was younger, Japan was the most advanced, biggest economy country in the whole region. It was the second biggest economy in the whole world behind the United States. So that tells you a lot about this realm's importance in the world, because now China is the second largest economy in the world behind the United States. It kind of took Japan's place, but Japan is still up there. So for a very small country, Japan sort of packs a big punch. Now, as Japan was gaining more prominence, and that happened mostly in the 1970s and in the 80s. If you know your history, you know that we actually fought Japan in World War II. And after we defeated Japan, we have a habit of doing this in the United States, is after we defeat a country, we then help them to rebuild. And that's what we did with Japan. And part of the reason we do that, part of the reason is economic. We want that country to succeed economically, so we'll have a future ally. But also, it kept them from being independent enough that they wanted to fight us again, basically, is what it did. So we do that. We did it with Germany in World War II as well. We've done it with other countries since then. So our assistance helped Japan to gain that footing. Now, after Japan got that strong in the 70s and 80s, then you had Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan kind of follow their lead, and they became really big hotspots economically as well, even though they're pretty small areas. Each of these are fairly small, South Korea being the biggest one. Hong Kong is actually part of China, mainland China, although it kind of operates as a special economic area, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. So those three areas kind of followed Japan's lead and became very large with regards to economy and manufacturing and trading goods with the United States. Now, starting in the 1990s, China has been a communist country for several years. And typically, a communist country does not fare very well with regards to economies and making a lot of money and the people being wealthy. Now, one difference that I've noted in my lifetime is that China is a little bit smarter, maybe observes the rest of the world a little bit better than most communist countries have in the past. Most communist countries, once they become communist, they kind of shut down because they want to shield their residents from seeing how the rest of the world is. They want total control over them. China did that as well. They have a very strict government, and they really control what their population does. However, their leadership, in my opinion, learns a little bit more than past communist countries like the Soviet Union and those communist countries and even Cuba. They're kind of looking around the world and seeing what works. And they realized that a traditional communist country was not going to work going forward. So even though they're still a communist country, they've learned from capitalism and what has worked in the Western type governments and economies. So they're trying to take the best parts of those capitalist societies and use them in a communist country. And because they did that, China has exploded onto the scene with regards to economic prosperity now as a country. Now, individual citizens there probably are not that wealthy as far as the average goes. They still live fairly simple lives, most of them, but as a country, as a whole, China has really taken a leap forward with regards to strength in the world in economy and otherwise. So, just a little bit about the geography here. If you remember, the Himalayan mountains run right through here. So remember that Indian subcontinent in our last lecture slammed into this continent, the Eurasian plate, and made these mountains. So in western China, you have a lot of very mountainous areas. For that reason, plus a lot of this area in the west is also very arid. Remember the rain shadow effect that we studied in several realms. So as far as their population goes, and they're the most populous country in the world, remember this realm and the South Asian realm with India, those two together have more people in the world than the rest of the world combined. Most of the people in China live on the eastern coastal area or eastern half of the country. Eastern third of the country, probably more accurate. The western part, because of its mountains and its desert climates, is pretty sparsely populated. And something else that I'm going to bring up a little bit later, pay attention to what's on the border over here. Remember I told you Russia's all along the northern border. You've got India, Nepal, Bangladesh in this area down here. But over here, in this area, you've got the Central Asian countries that we studied a few lessons ago. Your Kazakhstan, your Turkmenistan, your Uzbekistans, Muslim countries. So you're going to have this Muslim belief bleeding over into far western China a little bit. And you have minority populations of Chinese citizens that are Muslim. We're going to talk about some of those here in just a few minutes. So we also have a lot of islands here. Some significant islands. Again, Taiwan, Japan. Japan's an island country. Taiwan is one island by itself. And a lot of these areas have been disputed over the history between Japan and China, and who controls and who rules those. So, let me see. Again, China, of course, I told you the population, 85% of the entire realm's population is in China, is Chinese, and it is now a world power. When I was young, we would never have called China a world power. They were a third world country that had a whole lot of people, but on the world stage, they weren't that significant. Now they are. They are very significant and definitely second greatest superpower in the world to the United States right now. That used to be Russia / the Soviet Union, but China has replaced them in recent decades. So again, I've already mentioned these other countries. We have the two Koreas. They say they're not recognized as a sovereign state, and that's North Korea and Taiwan. I would not agree with that completely, that statement. This is from your textbook materials. North Korea is a sovereign state. It is a country. Even though it's a terrible country, they have a terrible leader, probably the poorest, most uneducated, least food, most hunger in the world because of their leadership. It is a very bad place to be. They are very volatile, always trying to attain more nuclear weapons and test those, because they have a leader that's just more or less insane over there. But they are a country. So is Taiwan. Now, I mentioned already Taiwan, there's argument, and China claims Taiwan as theirs. However, Taiwan is recognized by most Western nations and other nations that are not China as its own country. So, again, we'll talk about that more in just a minute. I've already mentioned this about the Indian plate kind of sliming in. It's kind of on the edge of this map here, but kind of sliming into Eurasia and creating the Himalayas, but also around the eastern side of this area. This is Japan right here. We have, remember from early in our semester, we talked about the Pacific plate, the Pacific Ring of Fire. That big Pacific plate is always moving around and colliding and sliding past these other plates around it. And that's we call it the Ring of Fire because of all the volcanoes and earthquakes that occur around this plate. So that's a big player here in Japan especially, but a little bit in eastern China as well. Taiwan is down here. So the Ring of Fire is definitely a player in Japan, specifically Japan. They have a lot of earthquakes. They have volcanoes. It's a very dynamic country with regards to their physical geography and their plate tectonics. Let me see. I already mentioned that. Again, here's a little bit closer view of that Pacific plate, and here's Japan right here. So that kind of tells you there's a smaller plate, the Philippine plate, kind of that plays a part in this as well. Tsunamis. If you remember a few years back, we had the huge tsunami in Japan that hit the Fukushima nuclear facility and caused all the problems there. That was very popular on social media and the news, so when you were younger, you probably have seen videos of that. That's an extremely high population density on the coasts of really both Japan and China, but especially Japan. Japan is a mountainous bunch of islands. So not many people live on the interior of these islands because they're mountains and volcanoes. So they all live along the coasts. So the tsunami that hit Fukushima was actually relegated to that northern part of the island there. So it didn't hit the whole country of Japan, but it was very devastating in that one specific area. When we look at climatic maps, you're going to see, especially, this is a comparison between the United States and China, and you see they're very similar. They have similar climates. You see CFA, which is what we have here in Kentucky, That's going to be a humid, temperate climate with really no dry season and a hot summer. You're going to see that same thing in southern Japan right here, and then this southeastern part of China. So if you were to travel to China in the southeastern part, you're going to have a very similar climate, winter, summer seasons like we have here in Kentucky. And you see the proportions are a little off as far as how much of each we have, but you can see if you look at the map, we have some very similar climates, and it kind of goes similarly from east to west in what those climates are and where they occur. So that's something to keep in mind. One other note that I just mentioned here, and it really is not mentioned in this lesson at all, but just for our curiosity, I've spoken a lot about what I do for a living, and I'm a scientist, and I work with karst a lot. Karst meaning the sinkholes and caves and all that type of geography in the area, physical geography of our area. So China also has a very large area of karst in this part of China. So some of our professors from Western Kentucky University, and a couple of those were in that slideshow I showed you earlier in the semester in your lesson when we talked about the Middle American realm, that trip to Mexico that I did. Many of those same professors regularly travel to China to assist their scientists with their karst issues over here in this part of China. So that's just something interesting to keep in mind there. Let me see. I'm not going to go too much into detail on the climates. Just wanted you to look at that map. You'll read about that in your textbook. Make sure you understand it. They're very similar here and there. So most of the people, as we saw in India, another very high population country, live either along the coast or in the fertile river valleys of the country. And you're going to see that all over the world. That's why civilization started along rivers, because you have the resources that you need to survive because you have the water there. And usually with water comes vegetation and animals. So that's why humanity gravitates toward these natural resources, because that's what they have, what we need to live there. So you have large farming populations. But, well, I'll say this. So there are a lot of people that live in rural areas in China as well, not so much in the western part as you see here on this population map. And I think the next slide, yeah, this is the bigger version of that map. But as you go east, you have more rivers along the coast. You have more population clusters. Remember our last lesson, we saw in India all this really dark red right here. That was the large river valley there, relatively flat up against these mountains. The mountains start right next to this, but in this flat river valley, the Ganges River is where most of the population lives. A similar thing you see over here in this area of eastern China. Now you do have the coast here, but you also have some major rivers flowing in here. You've got let me read my order. So down here you've got the Z or the Pearl River that runs in here, basically in this general area. I'm not outlining it specifically. Then you've got the Yangtze River that flows in here up north of Taiwan. That's the Yangtze. You've got the Yellow River that flows up here in the Beijing area of China. And then you've got, I can't remember the name of the last one. I'll remember here in just a second. In the very northern part, you've got another river up here that flows in. So you got what they call the four major river valleys of China. Here we go. So you got the yellow, which I pointed out. The Yangtze is going to be down in this area. The yellow is up here. The Pearl River or the Z River is down here in the southeast. And let me get that last one, the Lao River. That's the one up here in the northeast in this area. You also see some of the minerals and natural resources they have on this map as well. So China is pretty rich in natural resources with regards to mining and minerals. They have a lot of natural resources, especially the rare earth kind of minerals that we need for today's electronics. They have a lot of those mineral deposits in China. So we do depend on them to some degree for some of these natural resources. As a country, they have plenty of water resources as well, especially in the eastern half to third of the country. Remember, the West is kind of arid out here, but they still have water resources, just not as many people, so it kind of balances out. And it kind of gives you a little bit of just a brief description of these different river basins. You can read that in your textbook. So, along the coastal areas, you had a lot of peninsulas and islands. Of course, Japan, I've already mentioned, is a series of islands, 4 major islands. You've got Hokkaido is in the very northern part up here. That's the core climate. If any of you are familiar with a dog called an Akita, a really big dog, kind of looks like a sled dog, but it's massive. It comes from up in the Hokkaido area. Our southern area down here is Kyushu. That's the southern. It has a warmer climate, kind of like we do here, if not a little bit warmer, even though it's located further north than we are. That's because of the ocean currents. And then you've got the core area Honshu is the core area. So Kyushu, Hokkaido, and then Honshu is the core area, kind of in the middle. And that's where all your major cities are going to be in of your industry and economic activity. You've got Taiwan down here. Again, that's the island that we've spoken about already that China claims it's part of them. We're going to talk about more in just a minute why it is the way it is as far as China claiming it and the Chinese people that live there. So, let me see. I've already gone over several of these things. So China has a lot of natural resources, but they also need to import a lot of natural resources as well. So they do depend on other countries for trade, just like we do here in the United States. They have to import a lot of their like gasoline, oil, stuff like that. And slowly but surely, through the 1990s and 2000s, they have taken over a lot of what Japan used to trade with. They are now Australia's leading trade partner. I mentioned this in the last slide. The rare earth elements, 90% of the world's known deposits are in China, or East Asia, I should say, but a lot of those are in China. And both China and Japan traditionally have depended on some of the energy resources, basically oil, from Russia. Now, as we've seen in previous realms, that has been shifting to a degree because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, China is still heavily involved with Russia. They're still closely allied with them, so they're buying probably more oil than they did, but Japan is cutting back somewhat because of the war in Ukraine. So the ethnic makeup of these areas is like many areas of the world. It's very complicated. There's a lot of very small ethnic groups that live within these countries, especially in parts like you see down here in the southeastern corner of China. That's next to some of these other countries. You're going to have a more diverse ethnic group than you are in some parts. The Han, they call these the Han Chinese in the middle. That is named from the Han Dynasty you see over here. It was one of the longest lasting dynasties in the world history, I should say. And China is among the world's oldest continuous civilizations, which means basically the same people have ruled it for a very, very long time. When I say rule, probably rule is not a good word, probably make up the culture and inhabit the area. I guess you could say they've ruled it, but they haven't ruled it homogeneously, which means, yes, the same people are ruling it, but not as a dynasty anymore. They're now a communist nation. So think of it as the administration has changed, but they're still the same people doing it, is a good way to put that. So you can read about some of those other dynasties in your textbook. Great Wall of China, go back here. We've all heard about the Great Wall. It was built basically to keep the Mongolians from invading further south into China. At one time, the Mongolians were the kind of the bad boys of the region. They kind of were the warlike, very aggressive group of people from the steppe of Mongolia up there. Let me see. And here's just a little bit closer view of that map that we saw before. Remember the Turkic area out here. That you got Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, you got Pakistan actually right here touching. Remember the Kashmir area that we talked about in the last lesson. So Kazakhstan up here, so you've got a lot of Muslim influence up here. Now, when we talk about this Muslim influence, we're going to also talk about some, I'm looking at the list down here to see if it's mentioned there, the Uyghurs. I don't think they're mentioned in this map specifically. That's a minority population in this part of China out here that there's been a lot of talk about in the news recently, because China is basically just harassing them terribly, putting them in camps, almost an ethnic cleansing type situation. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on the region by any means, but the United States has really taken a stance against them treating those people so badly out there. This is just the history of how these different, I guess, organizations or governments kind of came to be in the country. Now, the big thing I want you to take away from this is China and Japan have always been enemies. From early history, early cultural history, Japan and China have fought. And it's been kind of back and forth who was stronger than the other. More recently, and I mean more recently, the last couple of centuries, you've got the Japanese invaded China in the 1930s. And they had a war from 1937 to 1945. So you notice there, World War II started basically in 1940-41. So this went on during World War II. But they invaded China 3 years before World War II actually started. So that was going on when World War II started. And from just the history that I've read, Japanese were brutal in the way they treated the Chinese. The Japanese always felt superior to the Chinese. They went in there and they really just were committing genocide, just going all out against them. And of course, you know, at that time, Japan was pretty strong then, and they were feeling themselves a little bit, and they decided to invade us and bomb Pearl Harbor in 1941, and that changed the whole course of things for them, because we defeated them by 1945, and pretty much they lost their entire military as a result of that. But before that, they were a power militarily, and they did go in there and just devastate China for a while. There was slavery. They enslaved the Chinese. It was the full gamut of what you can imagine in an ugly war like that. Now, the communists, and you see here, this is going to get more into the internal affairs of China. So, as a result of Japan's defeat, you had some changing of politics within China itself. So, by 1949, between 1945 and 1949, you have a lot of jockeying for position going on within China. And you had a civil war between the Red Army by Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek leaded the Chinese nationalists, and they had a civil war. The Red Army, as you know, China is now communist, and typically red means communist. So Mao Zedong won that war with his Red Army. So China became communist. So Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist movement, they left the mainland and went to Taiwan. Remember Taiwan? We mentioned that several times. So that became called the Republic of China. And then 1949, China officially became the People's Republic of China. So mainland China is the People's Republic of China, and then Taiwan is just the Republic of China. So that's kind of confusing, I know. So we'll just go with Taiwan and China. But now you kind of know where those two entities came from. So when the communists took over mainland China, they just scrapped everything that ever happened there and started over. And you can see what communism does. It took money away from the people. It consolidated everything into a collective. And they thought they were just going to really go forward and prosper with that. And anybody that knows history knows that communism pretty much never does that. It never gets to that level. And just a few years later, you had pretty much starvation happening in the country. Then they kind of had a cultural revolution, you see here, from 1966 to 1976. And that's kind of when the economy was bad. There was some infighting going on. About 3 million people were killed in this infighting. They call it a cultural revolution. I don't know if I would call it a full-scale war, but there was definitely a lot of violence that was happening there. And that kind of reinforced the communist control of the country. But by the mid-70s, early 80s, that's also when China kind of started looking around and saying, hey, we can't do the same thing we've been doing. The communist government, they realized that what they had been doing was not working. And that's what was kind of unlike other traditional communist countries in history. So they started to look at Japan and Taiwan and Singapore and some of those other countries and say, okay, what are they doing right? Why are they making so much money? Why are they trading so much? So that's when you started to see the Communist Party of China kind of get into modern times and not act like those other traditional, like the Soviet Union, those traditional communist countries. So again, I've already mentioned some of this. 1945, we defeated Japan in World War II. They could no longer spend hardly any money on their military, so essentially they didn't have a military. But what we did do is we had several American bases that we still to this day keep troops in a presence at. Even though they couldn't have a military back in those days, slowly over time through the 70s and 80s, we kind of let them start building their military a little more. So now they have a military. We still have presence there. We're strong allies with Japan. And they have enough military to basically defend themselves for a little while, but not enough that they could do what they did in World War II. So, but what they didn't have in military, they focused on economic. And they became an economic superpower by the 1970s and 80s. Now, as I've told you already, since the 90s, some of their competitors within the realm, China and some of these other, Taiwan, they've been gaining ground on them quite a bit. So the Asian tigers, you're going to see this in this realm, and there's one in the next. It's 3 countries in this realm: Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, and then Singapore is in Southeast Asian realm we're studying next lesson. These are some of those other countries other than Japan that started saying, hey, we can do this too, and started trading with the U.S. and building a very, very strong economic base for their very small countries, but very profitable countries. And that basically says what I just said with a little bit more detail. So you can kind of read through this in your textbook. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but you can see here in 2010, China surpassed Japan to be the second largest economy in the world. So from the 1970s, when Japan was just knocking it out of the park, 70s and 80s, until 2010, China finally surpassed Japan in being a world superpower. And here are some, and again, you can read these in your textbook. This is a very useful map. showing your major urban areas and then your special economic zones that China has created. And again, you can read about these more in your textbook. They will show up on your test, but it's pretty much from the textbook material. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that. One thing I want you to notice, though, is these are nuclear power plants. Look at how many are on the coastline. So you can imagine if a tsunami hit anywhere in this area, it's going to be like Fukushima was a few years back up here in Japan. So not great if we have big natural disasters in these regions. So I mentioned in the last realm as well, and I was off on the dates on this a little bit. I couldn't remember exactly the dates. So China started a one-child policy in 1979. And the reason they did that was because their population was just growing out of control. And they had, back in 1979, they were starting to rise, but weren't there yet. So they still had a lot of starvation in their country, and they were afraid that if they multiplied too quick, they weren't going to be able to feed all their people. So they basically said that each family can only have one child. Plus, unlike India, China's rural population was moving to cities. So China today is a predominantly urban country. So there's still a lot of people live in rural areas, but most people live in cities. And as I mentioned before, families that live in the country tend to have more kids because they need more hands to work on the farms and stuff. When people move to cities and become more educated, etc., they tend to have fewer kids. So between the one-child policy and urbanization, people going more urban, the birth rates went way down as a result of this. So the problem with that, so that was good at the time. It did what it was supposed to do. It controlled population growth, and their population is still growing. However, the population now, and as you see on this slide right here, even in these other countries that didn't have that, the majority of the population is getting old. Japan has the largest population over 65 in the region. Taiwan has a very low birth rate. South Korea as well. And with China's involvement, their population now, they still have a lot of people in that country, but they're getting older. There's a lot more old people than young people. Now, you might say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, when you have a society that has an uneven population with regards to the age classes, what you have is you have a lot of older people, and as you know, older people need more treatment. They need more help. They have more healthcare issues. They can't work once they get a certain age. So you're going to have a lot fewer people, young people, working to take care of a lot more older people, and that's not a good economic model to have, because you're just not going to have the money and the resources to take care of that aging population. So here's a little bit more detail about that one-child policy. I was closer on when they abandoned it. They did abandon it in 2016. And now they're even encouraging families to have more than one child. But it started back in 1979. I was way off on that date. So this is just more details about it. You see here, it had the desired population growth. It slowed to 1.2%. And by 2019, down to 0.5%. So it did what it was supposed to do, but they really didn't think about the aging demographic of their population. And right here is kind of summarizes that right here. It might get too old before they get the economic benefits that they're working for. So this kind of highlights the gender roles. It's similar as you saw in India. There's a little bit of a gender imbalance. There's more boys than girls because, like in India, boys were preferred to female babies. That has several different connotations to it, depending on the culture and what that culture values. Again, I'm not saying that's right. It's not right at all. I'm not condoning it. But in a culture, if you're in a rural area and you need people to work on a farm, they think the boys are going to work harder than the girl. And depending on culture as well, you might have rules and laws about who the family hands down their land to or whatever. So I'm just kind of telling you the reasons why some of these cultures are like that. I'm not condoning that in any way. It's terrible to even think about that. But they do induce abortions, the whole 9 yards. So it's a very bad situation when you have that. In addition, there's a gender pay gap. You know that in the United States, we're still working to address these things in the United States. We've come a long way since when I was young, but we still have some ground to make up. And that's even in Japan, which is considered to be a more progressive country than the United States. That's still a pay gap that needs to be improved upon in all these areas. So this is something that we've already talked about, so I'm not going to go into much detail on that. I'm kind of reading over this as I go because I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm just looking to see if there's anything I really need to mention in these slides here. So Korea, again, we're getting into the regions here. I'm not going to talk too much about the individual regions, but Korea is one that I do want to mention just because. So Korea was one country, obviously, for much of history. It was annexed by Japan in 1910, and Japan kind of controlled it, but it was still the Korean Peninsula. And once Japan was defeated in 1945, of course we have outside influences making these decisions like you see in colonial powers throughout history. And China laid claim to part of the Korea, and the Allied powers, which were the United States and Great Britain, France, and the other allies, we didn't want China to have Korea. So they decided to divide the Korean Peninsula into North and South Korea along the 38th parallel, which the 38th parallel of latitude also runs around the globe and runs through Kentucky, the northern part of Kentucky. So in 1950, just 5 years later, North Korea, with the help of China, invaded South Korea. Of course, if you know history, that was the Korean War. The United States sent troops to support South Korea, and we had a war for 3 years. It basically ended in a stalemate, which means no ground was lost or gained. We just fought for a while. The boundary pretty much stayed the same, and they did a ceasefire. There was never an armistice or a truce or a peace deal. It was just a ceasefire. So technically, there's still a war going on, even though it's not being fought actively. It never technically ended. But there is a ceasefire that was signed that says we're going to cease hostilities now, which now is, 70, 80 years later. And we have what we call the demilitarized zone along the 30th parallel. And we're going to have a question on that in your assignments and probably on your tests. So I think I have it as a Google Earth question on there. So let me see here. So North Korea, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of a rogue state. China, even though China is also communist, as is North Korea, but North Korea has devolved into not just communism, but communist dictatorship, which is just, they do their own thing. Even China can't control them anymore. And they're always, poking the bear. They're always threatening the United States. They're always having incursions into South Korea's water and threatening the attack and all this stuff. They do have nuclear weapons, and they're working to bolster those as we speak every day. And at one point back in 2012, we actually kind of signed a deal with them, saying, "Hey, let's roll back these hostilities. Your people are starving. I mean, they're in terrible shape there, and we thought we were going to make some progress and send them some food. That didn't work. They started testing ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads again. So basically, we're the same place we've always been with them. They're not really a threat to the United States. They're getting technology that they might be able to get a rocket to the west coast of the United States over to California in that area. If they did that, they would probably cease to exist as a country in the next couple of days. So I think most of it is just saber rattling. They just feel insignificant and they want to be important, but their dictator is basically starving their people to death. So that's where they are as a country. Here's Taiwan. I've already gone through this, so I'm not going to go through all these details right now. Mongolia, just mention them real quickly. Remember, that's the pretty big country up here on the northern border of China, between China and Russia. It's a big country. It's landlocked, which means it doesn't touch the ocean anywhere, and there's really not a lot of people that live there. It's not a hospitable environment to live in, very high altitude, relatively dry, steppe and desert climates. So China is kind of in their business a lot, but really as a player on the world stage, they're pretty insignificant. I mentioned this in the last realm. In India, China is trying to do this Belt and Road Initiative, which are sea routes, trade routes, and building roads throughout the Eurasian continent. And again, they're not doing that out of the kindness of their hearts. What they're looking to do is exploit trade routes and exploit natural resources from these other countries, is what they're doing. So this is something they're actively undertaking. They're in the process of doing it. I have no idea if it will succeed or not, or go anywhere. But they're trying to do this in more than 100 countries around the world. They're also getting very heavily, in today's world, involved in Africa. There's all kinds of stuff going on in Africa as far as unrest, civil wars, revolutions, ethnic battles, all kinds of stuff. And China and Russia both are in the middle of all of it, even though they don't claim to be. They're secretly trying to get in there to exploit the natural resources, and it's kind of a new colonialism, actually, from what the Europeans did years ago. It's kind of a modern version of that. These are the regions of East Asia. I'm going to let you go over this in your textbook, but basically you've got the countries, Japan, the Koreas, Mongolia, and then you've got China is kind of divided up into the three: the coastal core over here, the interior in the middle, and then the western periphery out here. Just a size comparison of the United States and Canada. Again, very similar in size. China's a little bit bigger than mainland United States. If you add Alaska, we're bigger, but just the lower 48, they're a little bit bigger than we are. But similar climates, again, similar climates from north to south. So pretty much a carbon copy of what we have here with regards to physical geography. And this is just talking about the way the Chinese municipalities are kind of divided up. You've got provinces, you've got cities, you've got these special administrative regions that I mentioned earlier, Hong Kong and Macau, and then you have autonomous regions. And these autonomous regions, here's the Uyghurs that I mentioned earlier, the ethnic minorities. Excuse me. They're obviously under China, but they kind of are so far out there, they kind of run themselves a little bit. So that's why China has gone out there and tried to lay a heavy hand down on them to keep them from getting too independent, I guess, is the best term. I'm going to let you read this, and this is basically how China has turned to capitalism to learn some lessons and try to emulate the success of capitalism while still trying to be communist. So, and then you've got these deltas that I mentioned earlier of the rivers, the megacities, Again, you can read through this in your textbook. In your special economic zones, I'm going to let you read this in your textbook as well, just because we're running out of time. But it does a really good job in your textbook talking about exactly what these are. There'll be some questions on your assignments on these. And you might have heard of Manchuria before. That's the extreme northeast part. This is Russia up here. I just mentioned that because Manchurian, they have their own dialect of Chinese language, and you'll hear references about Manchuria sometimes in the news or even some movies. There's a movie called The Manchurian Candidate, I think, something like that, from back in the 1980s, 90s, something like that. So just thought I'd mention that. I'm not going to go through each one of these because of time. This is just going over all the different parts of China. Here is Mongolia. I've already mentioned all of these things. Of course, China is its biggest trade partner. I've already heavily talked about the Koreas. And South Korea, by the way, is a capitalist democracy, just like the United States is. And you'll also see that North Korea is a little bit bigger in land area, but South Korea has many more people. The population is much larger in South Korea. It's much more money, trade, industry. The economy is substantial in South Korea. In North Korea, I should have put a picture of this in here. If you look at a satellite image of the Koreas at night from the satellite, South Korea is lit up like crazy with all the cities here. North Korea is dark because there's hardly any electricity in the country except for in Pyongyang, in the capital. I mean, it's just deathly. It's a very, very poor country. And it's essentially a cult. People worship their leader, just Kim Jong-un. Sorry. Since late 2011, he's ruled, and it's a communist dictatorship, but they have to worship him like he is a god almost. Know the term regional complementarity? That means they kind of need each other, their resources and stuff. Remember that. State capitalism. The DMZ, remember that. That's going to be on an assignment. Here's Japan. I've already talked about Japan quite a bit, so I'm not going to talk about it here as well. The Kanto Plain will be on one of your assignments. And we've already talked about Taiwan in detail. So that's it for this lesson. As always, if you need anything, let me know. A couple of you have a few assignments to make up, which is okay, but remember, we're getting to the end of semester, so make sure if you have any outstanding assignments to let me know or get caught up, because we're getting close to the end and I want everybody to be able to finish if you've been in contact with me. Thanks, and I will see you for the next lecture.